If I could just make a little quick speculation, David, on that, with that data you just shared. My own research has been looking quite a bit at the history of the Amalekites and the potential that an Amalekite actually could end up being the person known as Gog in the last days, based upon the prophecy of Balaam. In the Septuagint, the word Gog was used instead of Agag, and it was prophesied on Mount Peor, overlooking the area where Haman Gog is, his burial place, and said the king of Israel would prevail. And the Amalekites actually originated in Mecca, and they were the first enemies of Israel once they left Egypt. And God said at that time that he would be at war with the Amalekites for every generation. And if you look in the book of Esther, you'll find that Haman the Agagite was the one who came up with the great scheme to annihilate the Jews in one day, and he actually took the king of the Persians and took his armor. He basically paid for it to go against them and kill them throughout the kingdom, and it turned out to be the day of his own destruction. And there's many more parallels to what we see in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And in fact, in my own research, I've found that if you take his name, Haman the Agagite, and you look at the burial ground Haman Gog, they're the same words in Hebrew, except you add a letter Vav in the middle of both words. And that Vav letter in Hebrew was a symbol of a hook. So in fact, I wonder if in fact these are the hooks that the Lord refers to about bringing Gog against Israel. So I think there's a connection between Mecca and Iran or ancient Persia in their war, in this Gog-Magog war. And I also believe in the book of Daniel that their destruction is actually foretold in the next to last chapter, and it actually opens a window for the Antichrist that did come in and seize power in the area. Basically, it's an unveiling of him at the day of their destruction. So I know that's a long story for another day, but that was what I first thought of when you mentioned the 666 connection to both of those centers.
That immediately leads to what's going on right now, I think, in South Ossetia with Russia and Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
That whole build-up, I think. And I'll have to return to it, too, because it even fits into the time-distance phenomena from the temple. And I also agree with what you have to say about that Gog war occurring, which would actually open the window for the Antichrist to unveil the Antichrist at its culmination.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the history repeats itself. I mean, you remember this last day, and I guess I'll just go into this number of what's actually happening with the Georgia conflict really quickly. We hear about it at the same time that the opening ceremonies for the Olympics occurred. And what most people don't realize is the Olympics were celebrated, actually they were the head of the time segment, the segment of time for the Greeks called the Olympiad, which is a 4-year segment. And so this next Olympiad will lead us to 2012. And 2012 has been talked about over and over again as being, some significant point in the Mayan calendar where time literally stops. The time literally ends as they understood it, and that their god, their feathered serpent god, would return to the earth. And that's the calendar ends in December 21st, which would be the winter solstice in 2012. Well, if you realize then how time-oriented an Olympiad is, the Olympics were in the ancient Greek times, and now we kind of, it's disconnected from that idea. It's interesting that there would be such a war showing up in the area that it did at the time at August 8th, 2008. So the signature was 888. In South Ossetia, actually the border between North and South Ossetia, where the Russians came in through this tunnel into South Ossetia, the breakaway province in Georgia, is 888 nautical miles away. Or no, it's statute miles away. It's one of those anomalies from the Temple Mount.
Mm-hmm.
I found out that 888 years ago, the Knights Templar were actually recognized by the Patriarch of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1120 A.D. The Knights Templar are the basis for almost all of the illuminated fraternities that we have at this day, especially when you think of the Illuminati, the One World, the New World Order, the whole drive to recapture again Jerusalem for this one world ruler. And that is, in fact, if you go back to the First Crusade, exactly what was on the minds of the people who were actually going there. This idea that if they could capture Jerusalem for Christendom, then the Messiah would return. Amazingly, the Crusades hit that number again, the number 88, or 888. When they captured Jerusalem in 1099 AD, they kept it. They held it for 88 years until it fell to the Muslims in 1187. And so you have this number showing up again and again. And this is strange. Because Jerusalem itself was called Jebus, or Jebusi, by the ancient patriarchs. Before it was called Jerusalem or Salem, it was Jebus. And that just means a threshing floor, a place where you would kind of a circular place where you throw sheaves of grain, and the animal walk, like pull, drag something heavy over it, and break the stalks off and break the grain off the sheaves. Jebus itself in Hebrew, if you actually add the letters, equal 88. So this number 88 is fitting into Jerusalem over and over again for some bizarre reason. And if you look at the ancient maps of where Georgia is today, based on where the in Judaism, where they would put Gog, Magog, and Tubal, you'll see them wedged perfectly up against the east side of the Black Sea and below the Caucasus Mountains, where Georgia is today. So what I think is happening is, at least symbolically, at least according to these illuminated sort of cabals that are at work, if you believe in that sort of thing, and I think also spiritual forces in high places, creating this signature in time that harkens back to that same idea of taking Jerusalem again, not necessarily for Christendom, but for that anti-Christendom, Christian but not. And you'll notice that the flag of Georgia today is a fivefold cross. It's a white background, and there's the main red cross in the center with four surrounding it. That is exactly the same ensign that was used in the Kingdom of Jerusalem back during the Crusades. And what the Knights Templar originally took was the fivefold cross, and then it's changed to the red cross. Right, it's one single red cross. Georgia itself is named after the kind of symbolic saint that Saint George, who took Israel, in the idea that it slays the dragon and captures the maiden. Well, Jerusalem basically is that fair maiden. The actual capturing of the Jerusalem for Europe at that time was considered as the highest thing that could actually have happened. Man actually working in a prophetic sort of way. But interestingly, you're seeing the same motif again in present time.
Well, you know what's strange about this, David, is that we now know, the data's come out, that Georgia was very heavily involved with Israel right now. Israel provided them all their weapons and hardware. There were 1,000 Israeli advisors on the ground. And now we find out that they'd actually had runways that Israel was planning to use to attack Iran, that were actually runways that provided the appropriate distance that they could reach with their aircraft. And they had a big scheme that's been going on for a long time. So there's a really tight connection. And people who regularly listen to our show would have heard this over the last few weeks. But others who may not be aware of that is that they've had this long involvement. And the Israeli advisors were involved even in part of that initial skirmish where Georgia went into those provinces before Russia responded.
It would make a lot of sense then that this would fit into the prophecy of Ezekiel 38 and 39. And as you were talking about the hook in a jar, that's a metaphor used by Ezekiel himself. God takes the hook and brings these armies into Israel and then destroys them. And you can see, I think, setting up rather rapidly of a situation where the Antichrist would be able to show up, because what I think will happen is if you have a Arab confederacy, backed by Russia, that comes into Israel and tries to once and for all take over that area, and they're completely wiped out. And you look at Ezekiel's prophecy by the hand of God, then you would actually see a lot of Christians who aren't really well read in the Bible in this prophecy, and many religious Jews believe that this was that last battle where the Messiah does show up. It was Armageddon. It's like a fake Armageddon.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, you have someone stand up on the scene who claims to be Christ himself.
Right.
And an ecumenical one at that. Somebody who says, well, Islam's okay,
right.
Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever, pagan, it doesn't matter, but Jerusalem will be the place where I'll rule, and he'll actually cause the old Mosaic system to come into play again. And according to what Ezekiel and John say is, having the temple there, but then the court of the Gentiles not even being measured, this idea that there's simultaneously on the Temple Mount is being occupied by both a Jewish temple and, say, the Dome of the Rock, shrine to even Islam, and shrine to almost every other religion, at the same time as that there is a temple there. That would fit perfectly into this anti-Christian world.
Well, the Jews believe that the Gog-Magog war is their Armageddon, and that after that it'll all be peace and love happily ever after, which we know that's just the beginning of the end. But one other comment I want to mention to you about Mecca, the Mecca connection with the Amalekites and the battle with the neighbors. The whole idea of the 12th Imam that the Shiites believe is that he will suddenly appear in Mecca, and he will appear at the Kaaba and announce himself, and he'll draw these other men that support him, these leaders, and they will conquer the surrounding nations like Iraq and Syria, and then they'll go in league with the king of Persia and come up on the hills of Jerusalem and conquer it. So it's the exact picture of what we see of Gog-Magog, what they're expecting. And we have this scenario in, I believe, Isaiah 17, where the destruction of Damascus. And more people are now seeing this as a precursor war, where the immediate neighbors of Israel, like Jordan, Egypt, others, are devastated, and even Israel is largely devastated. But God sends Jews from around the world to come back and repopulate, bring wealth back into it, and that's why the land is recovering from war, as it says in Ezekiel 38, when suddenly they get the great idea to plunder it. So I just see more and more of this. But if in the next to last chapter of Daniel, it mentions the last king. Now, this is a little bit earlier than what other people would see the Antichrist, but the last one they mentioned there, the king of the north, that we don't read of him dying, it says that he's placed in the area of the king of the north of the Seleucid kingdom, which we know covered the area of northern Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, that general area, which would be a demilitarized zone between Iran and Israel if one of these wars occurred, particularly if the kingdom of Damascus and Syria fell. So I could see a demilitarized zone with some kind of viceroy or military overseer over this area. And then Daniel says that he witnesses a great army fall before him, and I wonder if in fact this could be the army of Gog that falls, because immediately after that, through great intrigue, he begins conquering one land after another, and I think that's an ideal time for him to sign that 7-year treaty to come in as the supposed savior, of the people at that time. So that's another way that I would interpret the 666 being a means by which Antichrist is unveiled. By the actions that originate in Mecca.
Yeah, it does center around the temple also. I agree with what you're saying. This number 666 shows up again on the 360-day calendar between the first destruction, the first temple's destruction in 587 BC, and then the second temple's destruction in 70 AD. The first was by the Babylonians and the second by the Romans. The distance between those two destructions of those two different temples and the same exact temple mount, same site, was 657 calendar years, solar years, 365 days each, or 666 years, 360 days to a year. And every time, it's always pointing back to the temple site. And at first I was kind of wondering, too, why would Jerusalem be stamped with this number, even if latitude and longitude equals 66.6. So this is where this event, this Antichrist, whose mark is identifying Mark, is 666. That's where it's all going to happen.